home late after a wild night out. He didn't believe my story and wanted a divorce. Hello Reddit, my name is Isabella and I'm a 24-year-old Englishwoman. I own a small but blooming bed and breakfast motel. For people who don't know what that is, it's a type of hotel but just slightly different, more homely, and the guests are not treated as strangers. We gather together to eat, and therefore you could make new friends and bond with people. And I really am not here to talk about my work. I have a different priority coming to this app to write this. I need urgent advice. I'm in deep trouble with my husband, and I have tried so hard to get him to just forgive me and listen to me, but he wouldn't listen to me, and he hates me. Edward is everything I've ever wanted in a man, and I really don't want to lose him. Without him, everything will come crashing down, and I mean it literally. Edward found out about something I tried so hard to hide from him, and now he wants a divorce, and I really cannot let him go. It's Christmas, a season of love. If there's someone out there who could help me rebuild mine with some sort of advice or a way out of this mess I got myself into, I'll forever be indebted to that person. I came home late after a wild night out. He didn't believe my story and wanted a divorce. Truth is, I really wasn't exactly telling the truth too, and Edward had found out about my lies, and he now wants nothing to do with me. I hadn't exactly gone out with friends, and things had gotten out of hand quickly, and we were drunk and spent a whole lot of time outside, like I had told my husband. In truth, I had been with Sam, and I had lost track of time, and before I knew it, it had been midnight, and by the time I could get home, it was around 2 a.m, and Edward had been wide awake, sitting on the sofa in the living room waiting for me. Sam is Edward's estranged friend, whom they cut connections with, because he had always had the habit of trying to get into his friend's girls' panties. I know you're wondering what I was doing with Sam, particularly at that time, when I am very much married. Yes, you guessed right. I had been cheating on my husband, and he found out about it, and he's so angry and wouldn't even let me go anywhere near him or try to talk him out of his decision. I know I'm the worst wife for cheating on her husband, and I truly have no real excuse, but I cannot lose Edward, guys. I only met Sam at our wedding. He had come as the groom's friend. All through the 3 years Edward and I dated for, I never once met Sam, but I'd always heard stories about him. Before I met Edward, my husband, I had a very wild past. I wasn't into drugs or anything of that sort, but I was a wild party girl. My father is a pastor. He had always been this upright man that never wanted his children to go astray, and he led a church. So he preferred his children to be perfect examples to the church, that he was doing a good job. And in all honesty, my siblings were the best. They were very brilliant and decent, and they loved the Lord almost as much as my parents did. My mom would always sing praises of them whenever they did something, and even the church loved them. I am the second child, and we're only 3 girls, but I was the direct opposite of my siblings. Right from a young age, I had known that I could never be like my perfect parents and siblings. I was not exactly brilliant, and I struggled with my studies, even though my parents never complained, only encouraged me to push beyond my limits. But it only felt like they were forcing me to be like their other children. And then I hated going to church where everyone pretended to be holy and good people when they weren't. I felt that being stuck living with my sisters and my parents' perfection was enough to choke me. Having to come to church to witness people pretend to be who they're not was the worst. I left the house the first chance I got, and that had been at the age of 17. I manipulated my parents for years. They thought I had gained admission because I had paid a tech guy that I knew through a friend back then to help me manipulate an acceptance letter into a major university so I could get the chance to leave home. In truth, I had not even applied for any school or anything. I had just wanted to leave the house, and I knew that had been the surest way to do so. My parents, especially my mom, had been so happy and bragged about it nearly to anyone who cared enough to listen, and I had felt almost bad and guilty that I lied to them about it. Now, as I write, I really wish I had done better and actually strived and gained the admission truly. So my parents gave me money for my tuition fee, accommodation, and feeding, and I used that to travel to another city. It was the same city where the school was located. I thought being there, I could pretend that I was one of them, when I truly wasn't. I at first enjoyed my first few months of freedom, which equates to not being woken up in the wee hours of the day to pray, or being ushered to church when anyone shouldn't even be awake at those periods. But then I got bored of just sitting around, doing almost nothing except lying around and eating while using the allowance my parents gave me every week to buy clothes that would make my mother faint if she saw them. I started making friends with some girls in the school, and they all assumed I was also a student, so I went with the flow. I knew I should have corrected them, but I enjoyed being tagged along, so I just kept it to myself. My friends that I made loved to party, and since they went to all parties, invited or not, I was allowed to go with them to each one. I enjoyed partying so much with my friends and the fact that we were all so daring. It had been one time at a small party that I had been dared to have sex with a guy from the school that I had never even met before, and I had done it because I didn't want to seem like a party pooper or a no-fun person. So, that was my first experience. I had been a virgin until that night, and the first time had been horrible. The guy must have thought I was a girl who did it all the time because he had just bent me over the sink in the small bathroom of the club being used for the party and slammed his male genitals into me without warning and had just humped me. It hadn't even taken 5 minutes before it was over, and it had been the most painful 5 minutes of my life having to suffer through the whole thing. I had felt dirty and ashamed of myself, especially because he realized only after the whole thing that I had been a virgin after seeing the blood on my dress, and he had laughed and told me he probably did me a favor. I avoided my friends for a while after leaving the party through the back door because I knew the guy had gone back to the party and bragged about being my first. But eventually, I shrugged it off and replaced the horrible memories with more fun-filled ones. I had sex with many other guys, most of them one-night stands because I couldn't bring myself to commit to anyone. It was so much fun just how much guys would want from a girl who is not willing to bend or break her back for them. I became the master of the game, the seductress and temptress, as I was being called. My reputation preceded me, and I loved it all. Every guy wanted to have a taste of me, and I got to get my pick of guys. It didn't help matters that I had quite an alluring beauty, and the perfect shapes to go with it, thanks to my mom's genes, although she keeps hers hidden in those hideous clothes she wore. Well, my life as the temptress was short-lived, as my parents found out that I wasn't a student at all after 3 years. They apparently had a long-term friend who they had reconnected with, and unfortunately their old-time friend was a professor at the university I claimed to attend, and coincidentally, I was supposed to be taking his course that year, as I was supposedly studying accounting. The professor had told them that he had never seen me before because apparently he had a photographic memory, and he remembered all his students by their faces and names, and a picture of me standing in front of the school's statue had not picked his brain at all. I had sent that picture to them to convince them I truly was at school, and they had shown it to the man who had told my parents that he had never seen me before. The professor had even gone ahead and pulled strings to check whether or not I was a student in the school, and that had outed me to my parents. My parents had been so mad, especially my father, who had cut me off totally and refused me access to see even my mother, and all my allowances, too, were placed on hold indefinitely. The money I had with me was what I gathered to pay the overdue house rent, and I had to get a job to support myself. And that was when I started working at a bed and breakfast motel. I had loved working there so much, I decided then and there that was what I wanted to do when I had enough capital to. The owner, Anna, who had been widowed then, had been lonely and had decided to put in all of her husband's wealth that he left her into creating a sort of homely environment for guests who were in a new town and needed a place to crash. It wasn't hotel standard, and that was what made it unique and special. And Anna's guest house was always so full of people that she had expanded the house twice within a year of me working with her. And by that time, I was already responsible. My friends had discovered shortly after my parents did that I wasn't a student of the school like I had pretended to be, and they had decided that they didn't want to be friends with me anymore. Since they got invited to nearly all parties, I couldn't risk going because I knew how petty they were. They would announce it generally if they saw me in any of the parties and embarrass me. So I stopped going out in general, and I just stuck to my job. My job there was to help Anna get the groceries and do the cleaning. Sometimes I helped her cook because she did all the cooking, and then I'd have to go upstairs and wake everyone up for breakfast. She provided them with breakfast and dinner and made sure the fridge was stuffed with enough beverages in case anyone wanted to eat something in the afternoon. I dreamed about owning my own bed and breakfast motel ever since I started working there, and I wanted a few changes for myself. Like how having to wake everyone up was very stressful. I'd have a little bell that I'd have connected to each room to alert them that food was ready. And then once you missed dinner, you had to wait for breakfast the next morning or get something to eat outside. But I made sure mine wasn't so. There was more than enough food so you could just pick up your dinner and microwave it when you were back. Also, when I indeed started mine, I included some touring activities, if guests were interested in being given a tour around town, so they knew some places. But I didn't achieve this dream until Edward came into the picture. Edward had been a guest at the bed and breakfast motel, and that had happened because his secretary had made a mistake of forgetting to book him a room at his usual hotel whenever he came into town for work, and it had been midnight, and there weren't exactly many hotels around, so he had settled for our place. I had been the one to welcome him, and I had made him some eggs and toast to eat for that night. We had talked briefly that day, and Edward had been really nice and kind to me. He was supposed to stay for just 3 days, but he ended up spending a week just because he wanted to spend more time with me. Edward was very caring, and I could honestly say I had not met a man like him. Unlike the other party buds that I had been with at the university, who only wanted one goal, and that was getting into my panties, Edward was really romantic and gentlemanly. At first, I had thought it was because he wanted to get into my panties too, but Edward had shown more interest in getting to know me instead, and had talked with me about my dreams and everything else. Although I never told Edward about my past, and the real reason why my parents were no longer speaking to me again. I had only told him that we had an awkward relationship because I hadn't wanted to go to a university. Edward had left after that week with the promise of coming back soon, but that had been another 2 weeks. Within those 2 weeks, we talked literally every day, and I found myself falling in love with him more and more. It didn't matter that he was almost 10 years older than me, and that he lost his wife in a tragic accident after only 3 weeks of being married, and he had been celibate for 5 years mourning her until he met me. Although I felt sorry for him, I was happy because it meant I got to have him for myself. And when he finally came around as promised, he proposed marriage to me, which I had accepted gladly. Edward had insisted I invite my parents for our wedding, and I had agreed. But since Edward did not know my parents, I had paid some strangers to act like they were my parents, and I had told them the details they needed to know about me to make it more believable, and Edward, of course, had fallen for it. I didn't want to have to go back and beg my father. He threw me out and cut me off without another thought, and it made me hate him. So within a month, I was safely married to Edward, the love of my life. I moved to his own home and quit my job at the bed and breakfast motel. Edward's wedding gift to me had been a land to build my own bed and breakfast motel, and I had been so happy. He even became the sole investor in my business, and he was the one who paid for everything needed to put up my dream motel. He was an investor who didn't gain anything from it, but yet he kept investing his money and never asked for the financial records. Like I said before, it had been at our wedding that I met Sam. Edward did not like him very much, especially because he had done some horrible things in the past to him, and he tried to stay away from him as much as possible, but it was almost impossible because they had mutual friends. Edward had not even invited him to the wedding, but he had come anyway, and I could see exactly why Edward disliked him as soon as he had introduced himself. He had winked playfully at me and flirted with me, and Edward had quickly drawn me away from him. But throughout the party, whenever my eyes strayed to where he stood gulping champagne, his eyes were on me, and it made me uncomfortable in a lot of ways. After the whole wedding, Edward and I decided we wanted to wait a year before trying for kids. We wanted to get to know each other better before bringing kids into our equation, especially because we didn't exactly court for long. We didn't even court at all. It had all been just talking and straight into marriage. Business was going on well, and Edward and I were falling more and more in love with each other by the day. I had never been happier in my life, but the happiness was short-lived when, after a year, as we had discussed, we started trying for a child, and all efforts were just futile. We went to the fertility clinic, and we were medically cleared to have kids, but still, there was no baby. Each month I got my period without it trying to even be later than usual. It placed pressure on me, and despite everything Edward would say and do to reassure me, I was just tense. I even started to take it all out on Edward, even though he never complained and would still try and calm me down instead of getting angry for the injustice of it all. After trying for almost 2 years for a child and still no luck, I gave up and started looking for other means to have a baby. I tried IVF, but it failed twice. Edward had suggested surrogacy or adoption, and it had caused a huge fight between us as I accused him of cheating. Now that I write this, I realize just how stupid that was, because how could I have related adoption and surrogacy to having an affair? But then Edward had apologized and had never mentioned it again. But the real reason I was mad was because the surrogacy thing was never going to work. When I had gone for another fertility test, this time without Edward, I had discovered that my eggs were bad, and that they had nearly no chances of becoming a baby even when fertilized. So even if we did have a surrogate mother, it would be Edward's and the woman's baby, not mine. But I never told Edward the outcome of the test I did. In fact, my visit to the clinic had remained a secret until now, and I knew I could never look at another woman's child and truly call it my own, because my blood doesn't run in their veins. So, which also meant the adoption thing could never work. So that's why I covered up my real reasons by getting angry at Edward and accusing him of wanting to cheat on me. My affair with Sam did not start until after 4 years of being married to Edward. He had apparently come into town again and had decided to stay at my bed and breakfast motel of all places. I knew he had done it because he wanted to get close to me, so at first, that had irritated me, and I stayed away from my motel for a while. But then again, I couldn't afford to stay away for long, so I started going to work again, and this time Sam was relentless in his approach. He made it blatantly clear that he wanted me, and mostly because he knew I am married to Edward made him want me more. To be honest, I liked the attention. Although at first, I had planned never to be involved with him. I just wanted to flirt a little bit. Perhaps because he reminded me of my temptress days. It was all teasing at first. The whole thing was fun, and then it graduated into something more complicated, and then I just couldn't get out of it. Sam had all the right words for flirting, and he was sure to make me know that he was sexually attracted to me. It was all so alluring, and back in the day, I would have just gone with the flow, had sex, and forgotten all about him in a week's time. But then there was Edward to think of. I am married, and I loved Edward very much, and I knew if he ever even knew I was entertaining Sam at all, he would feel betrayed. Edward did not even know that Sam was staying at the motel at all. At first I had hidden the fact because I knew he would be upset, but then with the whole attraction thing going on between us, it got too complicated to tell him anything at all. But then there was that feeling of old days that Sam brought back, and it was all so alluring. I was very sexually attracted to him, and it made matters worse because he knew that fact and was using it to his advantage. And eventually, I gave in to his seduction. Sam and I had sex right inside the motel. We were so invested in being the master of the game, even in the bedroom, that we had lost track of time with everything. And I had forgotten I was supposed to meet Edward that day at our favorite restaurant for a lunch date. I only saw Edward's calls after the whole thing, and by then hours had passed. I rushed home, and Edward had been waiting, worried about me. I had lied that evening that one of the guests at the motel had been severely sick, and I had to escort her to the hospital as the person responsible for her. Edward had been worried and had even offered to come with me to check on her the next day, but I had given him excuses like the woman would probably not be comfortable with that much attention, and then she would be good to go back to the motel that morning. Edward had agreed with me and sent his regards while I had left the house under the pretense that I wanted to pick up the woman and take her back to the motel. But I had gone to the motel and went to meet Sam. We, of course, continued our affair. I even closed down my motel temporarily so that people would not suspect me, especially knowing I was married. I knew that people being around there and probably finding out that I'm married would suspect my relationship with Sam. But Edward did not know about shutting down the motel temporarily because I went to the motel every day. But it was to spend time with Sam, who was still staying at the motel. Edward had almost found out about us one day when he had wanted to surprise me and pick me up for dinner, and I had been in with Sam. I had forgotten about the signboard I placed outside to inform people that I was closing the motel temporarily. so when Edward had called and asked where I was, I had told him I was at the motel, thinking he was just checking up on me. He had told me he was outside, and I had rushed outside to meet him. When he had asked about the signboard and why he hadn't known the motel was shut as the investor, I stammered through the lie. Eventually, I told him I wanted to renovate some rooms, and it had been an impromptu decision, and I was going to tell him tonight. Edward had said nothing about it. I knew he didn't believe me totally, but I was glad he didn't question why he didn't see the renovators inside the building. I eventually had to open up the motel after one more week because I didn't want Edward to suspect me further, but Sam and I still found a way to sneak around the guests and do everything sexual. Sam started to want to complicate things by asking me to stay over the night, knowing fully well that Edward would suspect us. Sometimes he would purposely switch off my phone when Edward's calls were coming in, and another time he had texted Edward, "I'm busy, stop calling." It had pissed me off, and I had threatened to throw him out of my motel. After the whole affair started, I found out that he actually had nowhere to go. He had been fired from his job because of some misconduct, and he had been staying in the apartment provided by the company he used to work for. So he had been evicted, and he was a reckless spender, so he had no money on him. I knew throwing him out would put him on the street, so I had threatened him with that. I only kept him there because he satisfied me sexually and not because I was in love with him. He had begged me and had promised to stop it, but I guess all his actions had implicated me indefinitely already because all the odd behaviors had probably made me suspicious. Edward started to behave really odd, and I thought it was because of work, and I hadn't even paid much attention to it. He would just leave the house and not come back until evening, and on weekends, which he always wants to spend with me, he usually made excuses for work. But then, that dreadful day had come when everything had come crashing down. That evening, Sam had texted me to tell me he was really sick, and I had rushed down worried about him, but he had actually not been sick. He had just wanted me to come around, and he knew that was the only way he could get me to come in the evening. I had been upset at first, but Sam had convinced me to stay for a while. I agreed, and we opened a bottle of champagne, and then we had, of course, ended the whole thing on the bed. I had slept off exhausted after the whole thing, and by the time I woke up, it had been midnight, and I had rushed to get home. But by the time I could get home, it was well past midnight. Edward had been sitting on the only sofa in the living room, and I had been shocked to see him there. I was expecting he would be asleep, and I would have been able to just sneak on the bed and then come up with a lie. Edward had asked where I was coming from, and I had stammered, trying to come up with a lie. I had told him that I went out with my friends, who I met some days before, and we had a lot to catch up on, and time just wasn't on our side, and it was late before I realized it. Edward had just laughed at my lie, and then dropped a document on the table for me to check through. I was shocked by the content of the document. There had actually been several pictures of my compromising positions with Sam, both inside the room I allocated to him, and sometimes when we were feeling daring, and we would have sex in the kitchen or living room. All the pictures were there. And the other thing in the document had been a divorce paper, and there was one signature on it already, Edward's. I begged and tried to explain to Edward, but he wouldn't even speak to me, saying the pictures were more than enough to explain everything that needed explaining. Please, guys, I cannot lose Edward. I love my husband, and losing him now will be the death of me, my business, and my life. Please, guys, what do I do? Update. Hello, Reddit. I cannot begin to explain how awful I feel about everything. I'm a failure. I just realized it stupidly. I failed at everything. Being a wife, being a mother, being a business owner, even at being a child to my parents. My life is literally over. I've destroyed everything with my own hands. Edward has finally gotten his divorce, and he pulled his investment from my business. And now the motel is closed down permanently. Sam, that sneaky bastard, was actually stealing from me. And after the motel closed down and I was trying to get a little money, I realized that I trusted the devil with my business, and now he's rotting in jail. I'm not the one who put him there, it's Edward. It's literally his business, and so Sam was indirectly stealing from him, and now he's in jail because he cannot even pay back because he had spent it all. I really cannot believe I thought about cheating on my own husband with a liar and a cheat like Sam. I shouldn't have been so stupid to have done what I did to Edward. He didn't deserve anything I did. He had never given me reasons to doubt him or his love. I am literally an empty can, and I cannot even have babies, and yet Edward never treated me differently. He was and still is the perfect example of the most perfect man, and I had him. I had that perfect man in my life, and yet I stupidly lost him out of my foolishness. I regret everything so much. I'm so lonely. There's nobody I can even tell all of this to. Even though I know I'll get blamed, at least I'll have someone perhaps telling me how to handle this awful feeling that keeps growing by the minute and feels so choky. But I've successfully pushed off everyone that mattered in my life away with my awful behavior. My parents, my siblings, and most importantly, Edward. I feel like the most horrible person on earth, and you guys certainly know how to make me feel even worse than that. It's almost funny how I came here thinking I was going to find some sort of solution or way of apologizing. I thought it was Christmas, a season of love and forgiveness. I thought maybe that would move people to actually think that maybe I did deserve some sort of forgiveness. Honestly, I don't even know what I thought because now I realize that I really don't deserve even a tiny bit of it. I don't deserve any sort of forgiveness. I shouldn't even be forgiven for thinking that maybe I could get Edward to forgive me after everything I did to him. He gave me everything I am and that I own, all was because of Edward. And yet I was an ungrateful wife who thought the best way to pay him back was to cheat. I should never have done all I did. I never should have. I hate myself right now. You guys cannot possibly hate me as much as I hate myself. The fact that the only man that loved me unconditionally now hates me is enough to make me hate myself so much I can hardly look at my mirror, because even staring at my reflection these days is a daily reminder of everything I have done. You guys have no idea how much your words hurt, how much you guys just seem to tear open the already so fresh wounds. You make me feel much, much worse. I wish you guys would censor your words sometimes. But then again, I cannot even blame you. I am to be blamed for everything because I could have chosen to avoid all of these, but I chose the opposite, so now I must bear the consequences of my actions. Living with this much guilt is almost heart-stopping. This Christmas is definitely the worst one of my life. The scariest thing is, I fear that this may be what the rest of my life will look like for the rest of my days on Earth. Update. Hello Reddit, it's me again. Sadly for me and happily for you guys, this is my last post here. And although I know how much you guys detest me and my sob story, it has been my only way of coping with my feelings. Not that it did much to help me, but I had been able to at least pen down my feelings and talk about it. It's been just a few more days since my previous post. I do not feel better, I feel rather worse, and there's no helping that now, is there? The street is so bubbly, everything is so bright and flashy, and I see people moving through the streets, not minding the cold, and just being happy to be spending this time of the year together. I see everything and everyone looking so happy and looking forward to the new year together. The painful thing is, I cannot even do all that because I lost the right. I lost the right to be happy or to even celebrate anything. I lost that right the second I decided to cheat on Edward. I lost everything the day Edward found out about my affair, and he had decided to get a divorce. I lost everything that day when Edward had looked at me with so much contempt and hate. I lost the most beautiful gift that any woman could ever have because of my stupidity. And I know that I'll pay for that for the rest of my life. Maybe the rest of my life won't even be enough to pay. I wish I had a time machine to just maybe go back in time and undo the damage I've done to myself. I wish I could go back and just stick to being Edward's wife and not have jinxed my whole life by having an affair. I wish I had never met Sam. I wish for so many things that I could never have. This punishment is just too grave. I hate my life so much right now. The rest of my life feels so bleak. I have no dreams or anything to look forward to. The time just keeps passing me by. I feel like I'm stuck in a frozen time, and the rest of the world just keeps moving. The thought of Edward moving forward without me in his life, and perhaps meeting someone new, feels like suicidal thoughts to me. The problem is, I know it will eventually happen, and there's nothing I can do to stop it really, because I had the chance to be in his life, and I lost it. But that doesn't stop it from hurting so much. I definitely wish I had done things better and not have to live with this guilt. I've discovered recently that I do have a photographic brain because I cannot even seem to forget every detail of that day Edward had shown me the document that sealed my fate. I remember even the tiniest detail like the room color, the color of his t-shirt and his shorts. Even the way his hair rumpled from probably running his hands through it. I cannot forget the look in his eyes that day when he looked at me and made me feel like the monster that I am. And that makes everything hurt even more. I desperately wish that I had not gone this far to ruin my life, but sadly, I have, and I have to live with that regret for the rest of my life. Thanks and goodbye, guys. Sure hope you learn a thing or two from my now very miserable life.